which is just that we know the Episcopal Church is facing a lot of challenges right now. The U.S. religious landscape is changing dramatically, and that in many places in the Episcopal Church, the basic unit of our church, which is congregations, rely on the extraordinary commitment and real sacrifice of our lay and clergy leaders. We ask very regularly sacrifices of time, talent, and treasure for the building up of our communities of faith. And if it weren't for that sacrifice, there wouldn't be an Episcopal Church, actually. And so everything that we're presenting is focused on the leadership model, which really addresses this issue of commitment head on. It notes that commitment levels of our lay and clergy leaders are our greatest resources, that they shouldn't be taken for granted of, and it asks, what can we be doing as leaders to build extraordinary commitment? So with that question in mind, we believe that inspiring extraordinary commitment means two things. Building a shared sense of purpose for your congregation, for your community, and then secondly, really attending to building leadership capacity. So part one, for those of you who are able to be there, focused on building a shared sense of purpose. It was about how to establish a clear mission and vision for your congregation, about naming what it is that you do and don't do, and painting a hopeful picture of where you're headed. And for those of you who weren't able to join, there is a recording. And Brendan, if you could type into the chat box where the webinar link is for this recording, I think would be really helpful. We'll be sending this out along with slides for part one tomorrow. Well, part two, which is tonight, assumes that you have a clear vision of where you're headed and focuses on building a leadership team to get you there. So it assumes some of the work that we did in part one. And there's a reason for that. A clear vision of the future has a significant role to play in leading major change. This quote is from John Cotter, who has written kind of one of the basic texts on leading change, about how having a vision of where you're headed is an absolutely essential tool to have for a variety of reasons, but especially in terms of building a leadership team. And so that's where we begin tonight's presentation. How does a vision of the future serve to build a leadership team? Again, last time we used the example of a fictional St. Mary's Episcopal Church with a non-fictional mission. It's very descriptive, I think, of a lot of congregations, and their vision. Their vision is that they are working toward a day when everyone will be engaged in their faith, and their faith deepened by weekly worship, when the lives of the congregants will be rooted in biblical stories and spiritual practices, when they'll be helping to improve the lives of the poor in the midst, when their ministries will reflect many gifts of the community, and everyone who walks through their red doors will be welcomed. So just kind of as an example, bear this in mind when we're talking about presenting a congregational vision to potential leaders. And I think that's enough kind of review to get started on today's presentation, which is about strengthening leadership capacity. And we're going to talk about it in three ways. We're going to talk about it in terms of identifying and recruiting new leaders. We're going to talk about the difference between leading and managing, and the difference between granting responsibility versus granting tasks. And we'll share some insights on how to offer ongoing feedback and support to those people who you do grant a certain responsibility or decision-making power. And just a note, I think, about context is we're presenting this material as if there are two really clear steps. First, you create a vision, and then you build a team. The reality, of course, is that oftentimes we're doing these things simultaneously. And so you'll be working with your leadership team to identify a mission and vision for your congregation, and then you'll be using that vision to build a team that will help you get there. It's an ongoing, iterative process, and very often we should be moving from one to the other. So that's just kind of another thing to bear in mind. So let's begin. I've already pointed out that vision statements are critical in terms of leading change. They are also critical in recruiting new team leaders. In many ways, having a hopeful vision of the future, one that is compelling and communicable, is a vital tool for recruiting your congregation's next round of leadership. As you might remember, a vision paints a picture of what your church or world will look like once you have accomplished your mission. So that's our definition of vision. It's a picture of what your church or world will look like once you've accomplished your mission. And we talk about using vision as a tool for recruiting because you want members of your core leadership team in a congregation, certainly the vestry, but thinking about different contexts, there may be a handful of people who form your core leadership team. You want those folks to be really excited about the future vision. And that may sound obvious, but it's inevitable that in even that team, some members will be more excited about the future vision than others. This is part of the reason why it's so important that the vision needs to be shared and drawn from the core team. And then secondly, it's also part of the reason why every leadership team, a strong leadership team, is constantly engaged in some form of recruiting. To put it simply, you want people who are 110% on board with the future vision of the congregation. This is not to say that everyone has to agree with how you're going to get there, and that there should not be diversity in that sense. It's just that you really want your leadership team to be genuinely excited about where the church is headed, and that means proactively having conversations with folks, different folks, to find out where their energy and interest in the vision lies, and making sure that they themselves are helping to form that vision as well. So looking for leaders in all the right places. I don't know if you're familiar with country music, but looking for love in all the wrong places, that's a song. And I would venture to say that oftentimes we are looking for leaders in all the wrong places in the Episcopal Church. And I'll quote an article from ECF Vital Practices entitled "Build a Healthy Vestry" by Janie Kurt Morris. And she describes what I think is pretty normative in many Episcopal congregations, certainly actually mine. This is the quote. When it comes to recruiting new candidates for vestry, outgoing members sometimes default to criteria that I equate to raising a red flag. Do any of these sound familiar? Quote, he retired and has a lot of time on his hands, so I bet he'd be willing to do it. Or, she's one of our biggest givers, so we better ask her. Another one, he's not involved yet, so maybe if he's on the vestry, he'll become more connected. She ends by saying, help. Now, I'm not saying that we should avoid retired folks or our biggest givers or those who we want to see more connected. It's just that I think we need a more deliberate approach to thinking through who we want to reach out to. So this list of who we need to be looking out for is adapted from another Episcopal group, the Leadership Development Initiative in the Diocese of Massachusetts. If you haven't heard of this group or checked them out, I would really encourage you to do so. They're doing some really great work. And they have a short list of people that we should be looking out for. And it is first and foremost people who are drawn to the hopeful vision of the church or world that you are forming. Um, in the last web conference, we mentioned the need to over-communicate this vision. Part of the reason why is that in doing so, you'll be letting people know where the church is headed, and people will have the opportunity to opt in. Some clergy have spoken about doing a sermon on it and then kind of looking for people who have a glimmer in their eye for that vision, and that's an opportunity to approach them and engage them about that. Um, Here's a big, really important one. Leaders are busy. Oftentimes when we think of who we should be asking to serve on vestries or other leadership teams, we tend to avoid those people who seem very, very busy and will only seek out those who appear to have a lot of time on their hands. There's a truism, though, in community organizing, which says, if you want something done, ask a busy person. You want to find people who are deeply engaged in their communities, work, and family life. Now, this doesn't mean that they will be immediately able to respond with a yes during the week of vestry elections. What it means is that these are people you want to reach out to and cultivate a relationship with over the course of over a lengthy period of time. And we'll be talking about how to have those sorts of conversations. Leaders make commitments and follow through. You want to, I'm wondering what happens in vestry meetings when people don't show up on time, or despite the fact that they may have said that they would do so many times over, or what happens when people don't follow through on projects that they're supposed to be working on. To put it very, very bluntly, I think we as leaders of congregations need to be proactively recruiting and replacing some of those individuals with people who do follow through. And so we need to be keeping an eye out for folks who follow through on the small things and make sure that we're giving them larger responsibilities, and that that we're proactively doing that. I'll just end there. The last point is that leaders balance, a leadership team in particular, balances results, process, and relationships. Especially in terms of building a community, we want to be finding people who offer a diversity of focus in terms of work. As you know, some people are more results-oriented, and they keep everyone on deadlines, and they care deeply about average Sunday attendance and budgets and other forms of metrics. For others, it's going to be all about the relationships, and they bring remarkable skills to building partnerships within the congregation and beyond. And for others, process is key. They want to review how vestry members are elected or the budgeting process. They want to look at how news is communicated more widely with the congregation. And what I want to say is just all three of these are very important facets of community's work. But it's likely that many of our leadership teams are stronger in one or two areas than in all three. And so when we're looking for other members of our leadership team, you want to think about, is there an area here that you need some filling out? So I don't know if you want to be doing, if you want to do this right now or later with a group, but I would encourage you to spend some time just making a list of some people who fit into these categories whom you'd consider approaching over the next month to discuss where the congregation is headed. Are there people who seem excited about the future of the congregation? Are there busy people who you'd never dream of asking because of their schedules, but whom you might want to start having a deeper relationship with? Are there people who seem good at following through who you wish to engage more? Are there people who will help balance out your team in terms of results, process, and relationships? So let's just think of a few names and maybe get a small group to do so as well, because the next step is on us. And it's really our responsibility to reach out to these individuals and start to build a sense of commitment among them. And what better way to do that than over coffee? So again, some of this is adapted from the work of the Leadership Development Initiative. Generally, this is really just community organizing, having one-on-ones, and this stuff works, and it's really wonderful that these tools are out there that we can bring into the church as well. So first of all, at the risk of repeating myself, I want to underscore that this is really about us approaching other people, not waiting for them to approach us. And the onus on identifying and recruiting leaders is on us. So hopefully you have a few folks in mind, or you can work with your team to come up with a few names who fit the categories we just described. And of course, the first step is really easy. It's really just about reaching out over email or phone or during coffee hour to set up a time for a one-on-one conversation with this person. It doesn't have to be formal. It certainly shouldn't be a meeting. It's just really a conversation over coffee or tea or whatever, in which you're meeting to explore mutual interests or to learn more about one another. So you're setting up a conversation, and let's talk about the elements of this conversation. First of all, it's really important to be clear about the purpose of the conversation. You need to present briefly and casually at some point, probably at the beginning, the vision of the congregation that you're working toward, where it's headed, and that part of the reason that you're having the conversation is to figure out if what the person thinks of the direction and whether they are interested in being a part of making that happen, and if so, how. So just from the outset, you want to make clear that in some ways you're building up toward an ask, toward a request for commitment. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Now, having said that, having set up the purpose of the meeting, you want it also to be primarily exploratory. And bear in mind the 80-20 rule, which is that you want the other person to be speaking 80% of the time. I know that sounds obvious, but actually it's sometimes difficult to keep the focus on the other person, and I think all of us need to improve on being able to do that. So one way to try to keep the focus on the other person is to think about who is speaking more and make sure that the other person is speaking 80% of the time. Your role is to be a listener, asking open-ended questions about them, about where they're from, about their work, their interests, why they started attending church, what about the vision makes them interested or energized. And the third, so it's just a general period of exploration, building toward a really specific request for some form of commitment. Now, this may be a really significant ask. You may be asking them to consider running for election on the vestry, or maybe the ask is much simpler. You ask them to attend a newcomers orientation event, or a dinner for new members, or maybe simply to grab another coffee a few months from now. But it really needs to be specific. And to the extent possible, you should follow up with them about that commitment really quickly. So if you're asking someone to say, let's grab another coffee, make sure that you get out your calendars at that moment and actually set the date. If you're asking them to consider running for election on the vestry, make sure you have or we'll get them very quickly the information that they need to make that decision. And if you're asking them to attend an event, make sure that you have what they need to sign up. The last thing I'll say about this is that having an ongoing practice of doing one-on-ones is the way you build up a network of potential leaders that you can call on over time. So maybe you commit to doing 2 one-on-ones per month and asking others to do the same. And over time, you're starting to build up a network of folks who you can call on. That's a lot of information, and why don't I just pause for a second, and if I don't know if there have been questions in the chat box I'm reading at the same time. So let's just chat for a moment. Elizabeth makes a great point. Um, One of the things that I think many churches do, and you can see the logic behind this, is, ask the elementary school teacher to serve on Sunday morning as the Bible school teacher, and or and that may not be exactly what they want to do as well on Sunday morning. And that there are also leaders who've been leading for many, many years, and there are opportunities to change role. Walter makes a great point, and we'll talk about a little bit about working with the team members that you have and giving constructive feedback to them and making sure that they do have the resources that they need to improve. That said, I also think it's healthy for a leadership team to have a regular flow of new members coming in, and to kind of mix it up a bit. And I think many leadership teams benefit from having people who are relative newcomers to the congregation, people who have been there for 1 or 2 years, because they can offer a perspective that maybe some of the long-time vestry members and members of the congregation can't. So that's also a healthy practice.
And I would also add to don't forget about other leaders and people in your communities that would be good to talk to, because those are folks that you also want to be engaged and connected with. You never know when there's going to be somebody who's a leader in your local community, be it in the local governments, other nonprofits, other churches, who may make great partners. That you may have something that's happening within your congregation. They may have something happening in their organization or their church or within their community that could be something where it would be really valuable to know about and to be able to team up with.
So Bruce asked a very good question. I'll be very explicit about, I think, ECF's bias, which is that we're a lay-led organization and strongly advocate that clergy and lay leaders partner together in all of the work of congregation, including certainly recruiting new leaders. So I think part of a strong lay clergy team means actively empowering that core leadership team to be engaged in recruitment. It's really important for all of us to be, presenting the vision and hearing people's responses and incorporating that into the work constantly.
And Elizabeth makes a really great point about not making assumptions. I would just give an example that a colleague of mine, was a background having done tons of things with development and finance and when at her parish, everybody was constantly trying to get her to do things like be on the budget committee, help with the endowment, help with the finances. Like, and actually, this person knows how to do that. But her real passion is for doing Crescio and for doing prison ministries, and really wasn't happy until she finally was able to make it into that and to be able to actually say no and not feel guilty about having to decline, and making it clear about that's just sure that's what she does for her job, but within her church she really wanted to be able to do this entirely different aspect of ministry, and despite the fact that people are trying to box her into her defined Monday through Friday role.
Okay. So as you have questions and additional comments, please continue to enter them into chat. And we're going to move on. So over time, let's imagine that all of us are adopting this practice, and we start to identify some leaders and get into the regular practice of conducting one-on-ones. The end goal is to be building a team of people who are genuinely excited about where the church is headed. In the meanwhile, though, there are certainly things that we can be doing as team leaders, both lay and clergy team leaders, to be strengthening the leadership capacity of those who we are currently working with. So going a little bit back to Walter Bryant's comment, we want to be building the new team members, but also strengthening those who are already on the docket. So I realize I'm not, I guess a quick word again about context. I realize that not everyone on this web conference would consider themselves a team leader. Perhaps you're a new member of the vestry or a volunteer on a committee. Nevertheless, I'm going to focus on the role of team leader because I presume that everyone here has the potential to be leading small groups soon or in the future, and that these are really important factors to keep in mind. So to lead your team, we need to make a critical transition from being on the left-hand side of this screen to the right-hand side. We need to move from being the primary, to the extent possible, and I recognize that this is hard in many small congregations. We need to move from being the primary doer of the group to being the person who sets the agenda, who keeps folk on track with the vision and orchestrates diverse tasks. So let's talk about that transition. In becoming a team leader or in asking others to step into that role, that person will need to be able to ultimately disidentify with the special tasks or projects that they've been holding close to for a very long while. They'll need to be able to step away from those projects that they've been directly engaged with and become more of a generalist. So in terms of a vestry, this is part of the reason why ECF does not advise or advises against there being like representatives or choir representatives or representatives from the youth group on a vestry. Team leaders and team members need to take a much more general view, and they need to be able to see the whole picture and make decisions based on that perspective, which requires, to a certain extent, being able to disengage with those, just slightly, with those projects that you've been primarily involved with. And while this is very hard in small congregations, we need to stop being the primary doers and instead be the person who helps to keep others on track. So second major point is moving from being an individual actor to being a network builder. Oftentimes people become team leaders because they've proven remarkably able to accomplish things as an individual. And we really love the independent leader. But one of the paradoxes or challenges here is that oftentimes those very traits that make a strong individual actor actually hinder the ability to lead and work through others. So this person has to learn new skills. They have to be okay with doing a lot less and instead focus their energies on conducting those one-on-ones on building those networks through whom a group is able to accomplish a great deal. And in this little chart, it also mentions, the role of keeping folks on track with the vision and delegating responsibility. So I'm going to talk more about that. So what is it that team leaders do? They learn to do less and spend more time building a leadership network and helping others accomplish those tasks instead. They, instead of assigning specific tasks, they give responsibility. They resist the temptation to jump back in and do those tasks for others when maybe they aren't actually fulfilling them. And they see their role as stewards of the vision, encouraging creativity and helping others to bring that vision about. And I want to spend just a moment on the second and third bullet point, which is about learning to assign responsibility rather than tasks. So what does it mean to assign responsibility? In a real way, it means handing over decision-making power to a member of your team who you see has significant potential. So for instance, instead of asking someone to help you create the pledge cards for the upcoming stewardship campaign, you're asking them to design the stewardship campaign itself. This person will work with others to determine the theme, the logistics, rollout process, and your role shifts to becoming someone who helps this person and group avoid the major pitfalls, and you're stewards of the vision. You keep reminding them where they should be focusing their energies. Jumping to bullet 3, in that kind of leap of faith in working with others, we should avoid the temptation, and this is really hard, to jump in and do the project for others. Even when there are some short-term and kind of minor problems or mistakes that you see from a mile away, your role is to talk with that group, with that leader, about those challenges and encourage the team to address the challenge in a creative way. The reason, of course, is that what you're developing is not just a really excellent stewardship campaign. You're developing a person who is going to continue to serve your community over the long term, and who will be able to be a stronger leader for their community in many, many different contexts. So it's more of a long-term vision. So another thing that team leaders do, and this brings us near, starts bring us near our end, is team leaders establish norms and give feedback. And I'm going to talk about two different kinds of feedback, public feedback and feedback given in one-on-one meetings. So let's talk about first group norms. In the Episcopal Church, a lot of vestries establish vestry covenants during an annual retreat, and I'll use this as my primary example. This is a really excellent practice. A vestry covenant is essentially a set of norms and expectations that all vestry members are expected to live by and agree to. And very often they outline things like how often vestry members are expected to show up on Sunday, the expectation that people will show up on time to meetings, having read their materials in advance and prepared to discuss the matters at hand. If you do not have a vestry covenant in your congregation, I'd encourage you to just to Google Episcopal Vestry Covenant. There's some really excellent examples. Many congregations post them. What's on the slide right now is lifted from, I don't remember the name of the congregation. It just summarizes a vestry covenant that I thought really nicely described some norms for the internal working of the vestry and then also being a public example of vestries. So this is a common practice that vestries use around setting norms. So that's wonderful. What we're not quite as good at is actually enforcing those expectations. Even when covenants exist, sometimes people don't show up on time, will come unprepared. And oftentimes the tendency is to address that inconsistency in private, asking the person, taking the person aside or maybe afterwards, um, uh, and having a conversation with them about that. We would, in ECF wants to encourage you to do that, yes, but also in some way acknowledge publicly when a group norm has been violated. And the reason is that it's actually not just about the person who is showing up late. It's also about all the people who have been sitting around for 10 to 15 minutes waiting for the person to show up, and who have to now sit through the repeating of the original content to that person to catch them up. You want to make sure that their time and energy is valued. And so finding some way of just very gently, very pastorally acknowledging when a group norm has been violated is a show of respect to that wider group. And there are fun ways of doing this. It doesn't have to be about shaming people. Many groups will set up a jar, and if showing up late is obviously one that happens often. If someone shows up late, or put $1 in the jar, and the money at the jar at the end of the year can go toward a party. Obviously, that sort of solution isn't always going to be possible. But that's one way of strengthening your team, and we just encourage you to do that, to offer that sort of feedback around group norms with the group present.
And we'd encourage you to also think about that in terms of how that applies to other groups within your congregation as well. For an example, that you have somebody who's doing the budgeting or the stewardship committee to add in norms about spiritual practices with that, especially in those sort of areas where we might need those reinforcements on. A great example would be to have that sort of commitment that we have a norm that we will spend the first 10 minutes before we even look at the budget, doing a Bible study or something like to that extent, and these can be really helpful for other areas of leadership within your congregation as well.
So that is one way of giving feedback, and it's public and it's about group norms. Another critical way of giving feedback is in one-on-one meetings, especially with the people who you have handed off significant responsibilities to. So imagine that you have indeed handed off design of the stewardship campaign for this year. You want to set up from the outset regular check-in times with that person, in which you certainly do check in and hear how things are going, but also you offer very deliberately feedback around how you see things are going. This is an opportunity to hear, well, okay. So when you're doing that, here are just a few things that you want to bear in mind. First of all, you want to be very clear about the purpose of the meeting. You want them to know that it's certainly a check-in about the project itself, but that you're going to be offering some feedback to that person, both positive and negative, and that the reason is to strengthen them and your own working relationship over time. You want to come prepared to this meeting. You don't want to fly by the seat of your pants on this one. The feedback, both positive and negative, needs to be very specific. you want to take time to check in, see how they're doing, and listen to some, what's going on. Most importantly, I think, is feedback needs to be focused on performance rather than personality. The one exception here is when helping people identify their own strengths. I think all of us are actually remarkably not good at identifying our strengths, and so it's really, really wonderful to work with someone else who can help you see that. When offering negative feedback, you want to avoid extrapolating from things that people are doing to personality faults, and it can be surprising how easy it is to go down that road. So you want to be very careful about your language there. Another key element of these sorts of conversation is problem solving. You are having these conversations as they are figuring things out, and so this is an opportunity to hear, well, let's talk about a major challenge and let's try to figure this out together. The last point is that this is an ongoing process. Um, you know, in the church, I think we have traditionally. Oh, how about this? Just not that. The value of doing ongoing feedback is that you don't have to wait 6 months to have that conversation, or a year, or a formal process. Simply having a regular check-in and kind of making that part of the culture allows you to be encouraging people in their strengths and also identifying and helping people as they meet challenges. And that's a really key role as a team leader to developing a strong leadership team. So that actually brings me to the end of our presentation. And I guess I want to review very quickly about how these two pieces fit together. Part one was about establishing a mission and vision for your congregation. It's about naming what you do and don't do, and creating a hopeful vision for your church. And part two is about using that vision to build a team who will help you get there. By really focusing on these two priorities, you're taking the we believe, we posit humbly, that you're taking the commitment levels of lay and clergy leaders very seriously. And you know that that is actually the greatest resource in the congregation, and that's what's ultimately going to lead to a strengthening of the overall church. So I'm going to move us to discussion mode, and let's have a conversation. Brendan, I wonder if I wasn't able to look at the chat box. I'm wondering if you could summarize some of what was being said.
Get some interesting comments, particularly, I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on in terms of the dollar jar, which does kind of prove controversial at points as being effective for enforcing norms. Of course, that's a difficult thing to do, but it's quite a bit on that.
I do. I mean, the one thing I would say, and we need to include this in slides for the future, is that you want to engage the entire group in coming up with something like that. This is not something that you just kind of randomly decide we're going to have a dollar jar. You want to have a conversation with the group and say, hey folks, let's think of a way in which we make sure we're honoring these group norms. Here are a few ideas that I have, but it really needs to be mutually agreed upon, and otherwise it does, I think, come a little bit out of nowhere, and can be shaming. Yeah.
Robert had asked a question earlier in the chat box. Is it important to note the outlines of the commitments? I guess, for example, we will have 3 meetings to discuss this, so it doesn't look like a lifetime duty.
I'm not actually clear on the question, I guess. Is it 3 meetings to discuss the norms, or?
I think it was, or Robert, if you want to type in there sort of what you were trying to get at specifically with that.
Tracy is asking, what are the best practices for communicating when your vestry and leadership teams number 20 or 30 people? All. I'm also not clear on that. There are some, all church vestries, especially in very, very small congregations. They can address their change their bylaws to make that a possibility. I think one thing, and I would encourage you to look at identify a resource. There's a really interesting discussion about, you want to engage your stakeholders in meetings, but just as important is sometimes you also want to just as skillfully not include everyone in those meetings out of respect just for their time, and so that things can actually happen. There are some resources for helping you think through that. I'll admit I don't actually have them off the top of my head. I hope that sort of starts to address what you're talking about. I fear many people fear being on a group because it will last forever. Yes. I think that's part of the problem with committees in general, actually. Committees feel like lifetime appointments at times. Whereas if what you're doing is setting up a specific team, that's supposedly what we use, team and committee interchangeably oftentimes, but this is a distinction between one. A team is set up for a very specific goal in mind. So a team that's set up for a stewardship campaign has a very set time frame and campaign, and it's much easier to set up project teams with a September campaign than to ask someone to serve on the stewardship committee, which will be responsible for every stewardship campaign for the next 10 years. Which is kind of the norm, the practice that we sometimes do, and there are reasons, I think, for both and value to both. But that is one distinction between committees and teams, and I do think that it's easier to get people to sign on to teams.
And even if it is in a traditional committee, I would give an example from my own congregation, the Flower Guild. This is where establishing some norms about the expectations for what you're responsible for can be really a lot of work. And so they have established a norm that there is going to be one person who will lead up for the assignments and for the special events and for Christmas and Easter and that for a 1-year time cycle. And that person has to rotate it because they've just found that it's too much to keep one person on board past that point, and that everybody expects that will just be the when you're joined, that's what they just say, that they expect everybody to share in leading up this group. At one point you will be, helping to lead this, but that duration will be this amount of time, and then somebody else will rotate in there, and so that's part of the norms for joining that group and for the continuing process if once you get into that leadership position.
I have a question for the group, which is how when your congregation, when you as a team leader, say, offer feedback, how does your congregation offer feedback to people who are doing really well or not doing so well on a particular task? Is that uh, uh, part of the culture? And if so, what does that look like? A great point Megan made. I think another place where that happens often is with treasurers. Uh, Careful handing off of the role of treasurers and making sure that there is information and resources to do that well. I think that what Mark described, or what Robert describes is I mean, it's descriptive of the congregations I've been part of. Um, Generally, uh, you know, I think we really want we want church to be, for lack of a better term, a nice place, and a place where that's not necessarily what happens. I think there are ways in which we can actually be very nice and still direct about offering feedback. Um, and I really hope, I really think that this is it's really critical um, to and respectful ultimately of others to be able to give thoughtful feedback about what they're doing really well and what's not going so well. Yeah. Mike, I'd love to have a conversation more about the situation behavior impact model. I'm not actually familiar with it. I think I can imagine, just based on the name, uh, of what that means. Um, but I'd love if you have a resource or a link to send, that'd be really great. Thank you.
Um, Amy, having been the person who has produced things in a congregation with spelling errors, I would say yes, I have done this. And especially when like especially the memorials for the Christmas flowers, and had one real bad blooper one year. But anyways, having been in that position and from my colleagues when I was in the Diocese of Chicago in that role, hopefully you should be able to go to that person directly, being able to being honest and being an approach of that because you care and because this person cares, and being able to tell them and share them about that, and it's not about the mistakes of Milton. I mean, there's granted going to be those curmudgeons who just kind of it kind of gives them the pure joy and pleasure to point those things out, but because you're doing this out of your care for the community, the well-being, and for that everybody's names are being put out correctly, that you're approaching about these mistakes. That's really the best approach, and it's hopefully it's to not triangulate and go around the person, and that can create a lot of problems with that dynamic. So that would be my suggestion.
I would just also add, I think this is part of the reason why feedback sessions need to be regular. With everyone who I supervise, I do have monthly check-ins with this person in which the entire point is to go over what's going well and what's not. And the beauty of that is that not every single check-in is going to be negative. Every single check-in will have significant amount of things that the person did well, significant amount that maybe certain amount that they could improve on. And the part of the problem with only offering feedback in more a sporadic sort of spontaneous way is that oftentimes we'll do it in based on our kind of personality tendency, which is we'll just thank people very, very much when they're doing a great job and avoid the negative stuff, or we'll only point out when they make mistakes. And having a regular sort of practice when it's on the calendar is that it means that occasionally it's going to be mostly positive. Occasionally it won't be as positive, and that's okay. It's just part of the regular culture of the group. And certainly, I presume that someone's supervising the secretary, the administrative assistant, and I think that person should be doing that. When it comes to working, obviously, with volunteers, it really needs to be the person who assigned them that responsibility. So, well, it is now 8:01, and I also want to respect other people's time. And so, I think you should actually in your email have right now an email requesting feedback about part 2. I forgot to mention this in our last web conference. And one of the things that we are always trying to do, going back to feedback, is improve our presentations. So please offer very honest feedback about tonight's presentation, and we take it seriously and try to improve based on that. And if you want to be in touch with us, here's our contact information, and we look forward to being in touch. So have a good night, everyone.